Welcome to Agent Link with Raymond J. Batvinis. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education here at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we're very pleased to host our good friend, Dr. Raymond J. Batvinis, as he launches his latest book. Ray is a retired FBI supervisory special agent and basic counterintelligence course instructor. As a historian and educator, he specializes in the discipline of counterintelligence as a function of statecraft. In addition to authoring scholarly articles, he has written 2 previous books. He is also the former executive director of the J. Edgar Hoover Foundation, and I think that's what you were doing when I first met you long ago, working on an exhibition. Ray will be interviewed about this fascinating book, Agent Link, by John J. Quattrocki. John is a former senior executive on the National Security Council staff with 22 years of operational and policy experience in the senior executive service. Now, John is going to grill Ray, or maybe politely ask him questions. We shall see.
Or settle scores.
Settle scores.
Settle some old scores.
Names will be taken. When they conclude their conversation, we're going to turn to your questions. Enough from me. Over to you, gentlemen.
Thanks, Amanda. And 2, thanks to the museum, to your staff. It's just been a fabulous accommodation. So, and before we get started officially, Ray, point of personal privilege, if I might. Ray and I discussed this. We've known each other almost 40 years and worked cases because we shared a border. I was an agent in the Washington field office. Ray was in Baltimore. And so what I'm about to say should not be misunderstood as me shilling for a friend. But what you've done here is, you have really written a piece that contributes substantially to the canon of whatever's out there with regard to counterintelligence, especially in the pre-1947 intelligence community, which is really, for many people in this room and for those watching on camera, is really a different period of time in U.S. national security, and with it, U.S. counterintelligence and intelligence. So I don't say that because we've known each other and we've worked well with each other, but because I've been teaching 4 classes in graduate classes in national security. I use Ray's other 2 books. This will now go to the list for the spring. And this is really, and I'm loath to call it the 3rd book in a trilogy because I'm hoping dearly that it's the 3rd of what will be a 4th and perhaps a 5th book, and perhaps we'll hear that tonight.
From your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, exactly. But this really is an extraordinary piece, which I strongly commend to everybody that's listening. And it is for this reason. As all of you probably know, and you can go down to the bookstore here and look for yourselves, there is no end to the number of books written that address U.S. intelligence, particularly after 1947, which is kind of the fault line for everybody. Fewer books in the pre-1947 period, all of them diligently researched and well-written. But what they do not have, and what Ray has done here with this book, Link, is they do not have the understanding of the hieroglyphics that associate FBI documents, right? Whether it's Beverly Gage or it's Ackerman or it's Gentry, people have written extensively on these topics, as Ray does here. They're all guilty of fabulous research and diligence, and God bless them for their narratives. But as I've got my old boss here and I've got my old partner here, every agent, when they come on board, you're told immediately, every document has to stand on its own, right? When you come in, you write a document in the Bureau, and Ray has culled just a treasure trove of documents, as I'm sure we're going to hear, over many years of FOIA requests and just hard work. And in every FBI document, there is a hieroglyph, with the new generation called metadata, but there's a hieroglyph on the first page of every FBI document. And there is so much context and data there. And you've pulled every last piece out of it. And the book you've written is just, it's captivating, it's narratively perfect, and I cannot compliment you enough about it or commend it to any of you more strongly. So with that, and it is so well documented, it seems to me there's 5 more books in your book. Let me ask you, of all the topics you obviously researched, why Bill Weisband?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for taking your time this evening. The traffic was a nightmare. I can imagine you know that. But thank you for being here. That's very, very kind of you. And thank you to the Spy Museum and my very, very dear friend Amanda, and to you, John, for taking the time to do this. I first learned about William Weisband when I was in the late 1990s. I was working on a contract where we were teaching the history of counterintelligence to CIA in the wake of the Ames case. And one of the modules was given by Robert Louis Benson and his partner Cecil Phillips. And Cecil Phillips was, because of his eyesight, he was 18 years old, wanted to do his part for the war, but because of his poor eyesight, he was turned down for the military. So he was the Army Security Agency and later NSA's benefit. He was a wonderful man. He passed away a few years ago, and he was deeply involved in the Venona project. Lou Benson, as he goes, I always say to anybody who will listen, they ought to have a statue of Lou Benson in front of CIA and NSA, and everybody should bless themselves every time they walk past it, because he was he's a remarkable, he was a technical counterintelligence officer with NSA, and he was a remarkable historian with them later on. So they did that module on Venona, and they always brought up William Weisband. That's how I first learned about him. And I heard about him a number of times when they would come in, and I just began to marinate in that story. And that was the equivalent of that itch that you couldn't scratch. And so in 2002, when I was working on my first book, Origins of FBI Counterintelligence, I applied for his FBI file, which I received, and we can touch on that. I also applied for his NSA file. So I applied for it in 2002. And in 2016, I was sitting on my back porch one lovely warm afternoon having a cocktail, and I heard a ring at the front door, and it was a FedEx package. And NSA sent me the first tranche of papers. So it took 14 years for NSA to deliver the material. So the next day, I'm just reading it, sitting on my back porch, when there's another ring, and that was the second tranche of information. So why it took 14 years, I have no idea. I don't even want to give it thought. But those were the factors that led to me to begin to work on that. And I started working on it in 2017, and it took me, 7 years to finish it. Mm-hmm.
So let me follow up on that for just a minute then. So before we get to the substance of Bill Weisband and his activity, let's round out for everybody, what are the other sources of material you pulled in besides the NSA material?
Right. The three major sources, the primary sources, original sources that I used were the FBI file, which was wonderful. They did a wonderful job in basically tracing his timeline. And the other one was the NSA file, because there were gaps in the FBI file that NSA filled in. Interviews with individuals that did not show up in this was the internal investigation that went on into the 50s of Weisband. Individuals that he knew, individuals that his wife Mabel knew. There were 2 excellent interviews done by NSA of her name was Dorothy Runyon, and she was Mabel Weisband. Mabel was Weisband's wife, and they were wonderful. They created a whole chapter, which we may or may not get into tonight, but it was excellent. It really was excellent. And of course, the third was the Vasiliev notebooks, and I'm sure everybody knows it, but the few who don't, when Boris Yeltsin was the leader of the now defunct Soviet Union, there was that period of time of rapprochement between the United States and Russia. And to be quite frank, the successor to the KGB, the SVR, was very short of money. And they made a deal with an imprint of Random House to open up the first chief directorate, the first chief directorate being the foreign directorate of the KGB, and indicated that they would be willing to open up the foreign files to the West, and they selected a former KGB officer by the name of Alexander Vasiliev. So Vasiliev is now out of the KGB. He never was in the SVR. He's out of the KGB. And they send him files. And he said, I want the file on Alger Hiss. I want the file on Whittaker Chamber. I want the file on this. I want the file on that. And one of the files that he ordered was William Weisband's file.
Right.
So he did not have the good fortune, because of time, to literally start at page 1 and go through page 500. He took a tidbit of that. It's almost like a smorgasbord of entries that he wrote down. And he literally sat there for months, and he just wrote it down. He was very, very meticulous, and he wrote it down. And that material, he worked with Alan Weinstein, who's now deceased. Weinstein later became the archivist of the United States. But the two of them produced a book called Haunted Wood, which I recommend to everyone. The problem was that they used maybe, and I'm spitballing here, maybe 5% of all the stuff that Vasiliev produced. So it's a complicated story, but Vasiliev got together with John Earl Haynes, who's a wonderful human being. He was the Soviet expert at the Library of Congress, and Harvey Clare, who's a professor emeritus at Emory University. Both of them now retired. And what they did was they got a grant from the Smith-Richardson Foundation, and they took all of this material. I can't begin to describe the enormity of the material. And they put it together in a form which anybody could read. You could take the name, you could say, and let's take my case. I took the name William Weisband, and they give you an index of where it is, and then you just go and you just pick it out. That was absolutely a godsend to me, because I won't go into a lot of detail, but my book focuses on the Weisband life, but there's a period there when he does his most damage. And when you begin to look at it, for me, it was a blessing, because I could trace literally what the FBI was doing during this critical period and exactly what the KGB was doing during the same period. The tit for tat, the back and forth. The problem was the FBI didn't know what the KGB knew, but the KGB knew what the FBI knew because of Weisband.
Right.
So that kind of gives you an idea about my key sources.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Mm-hmm. So what I want to do for the rest of the night then is, I'll ask you a little bit about who Bill Weisband was.
Right.
Important to me, and I suggest to everybody else, but because I teach, and for 15 years, Bill Weisband has occupied a half a night on one class, about an hour and a half, based on his time at ASA.
Right.
And that was kind of, and I think, as you and I have discussed, that almost seems by design now in retrospect, because as you say in the subtitle of the book, The Spy Erased from History, right? So for everybody, I think there's a lot to know just who was Bill Weisband.
Right.
And then we'll go from there to what were his periods of operation, and then what damage did he do? But so let's start at the beginning.
Sure.
Who was he?
Bill Weisband, his original name was Wolf, W-O-L-F-E, Wolf Weisband. Weisband was a Russian Jew who was born and raised in Alexandria, Egypt. He had two older brothers, Mark and Harold, and they had Semitic names. And what happened was, I won't go into a long who struck John, but Sarah and Israel, their parents, were victims of the pogroms. And I emphasize this, and they were living in Odessa, where the father was a watchmaker. And you can begin to put two and two together, because their victim, Harold and Shalom was his Semitic name. Shalom and Mark were born around 1892 and 1893. And then the pogroms, horrible pogroms, one of the most famous of all, occurred in Odessa in 1905, and then they moved. This is when you had the period of the Great Migration of Jews trying to go west into Western Europe and then immigrating here. They went south across the Black Sea, probably bribed somebody, made their way through the Levant and then into what is now modern-day Israel, and then settled in Alexandria. So they had a very small Jewish community in Alexandria. But what benefited him, he was just, as I argue to myself, he was a beneficiary of serendipity. He lives in this small Jewish community, so they spoke Hebrew in the house, and they spoke Yiddish in the house. He would walk out and go down the street and play with his Arabic friends, so he could speak Arabic. He'd walk down the street and speak with his English friends, because that was an English mandate in Alexandria at the time. So he spoke fluent English. His parents sent him at first to an English-speaking school. He couldn't get into the more expensive one, which was the Scottish school, so they sent him to an English. So he spoke fluent English. And then they sent him to a French school, so he spoke fluent French. So this is really what got him into the position that he could create all his damage. So when he comes to the United States with his parents, arrives in February 1925, most Jewish immigrants and East European immigrants, they were completely behind the eight ball. Why? They didn't speak the language. They weren't acculturated into America, but he spoke English. And what he was able to do, the first day he arrives on February 25th, 1925. The next day, he's working in a hotel as a typist. So he hit the ground running, and he went from hotel to hotel to hotel, and then finally he gets to the Waldorf Astoria. He was always trying to better himself. And then he gets to the Waldorf, and he was a charter member of the employees who opened the Waldorf. Now it gets gray. Sometime in between 1933, when the U.S. and the Soviets exchanged diplomatic relations, they opened up a consulate in New York. And somewhere, we don't know where, the record is not clear. In 1933, he's recruited by we'll just call it the KGB, and went through different iterations.
Right.
But for simplicity purposes, we'll call it the KGB. And it's quite clear that he was on a mission. And in 1933, we know that they trusted him enough that they actually had him recruiting people. That was very, very uncommon. He was really recruited by them originally to be a courier. And I go into a little bit of an explanation as to what a courier does. His job is to take documents. If you're a spy, and you have direct access to information on new petroleum techniques, new types of petroleum, new types of acquiring petroleum, he would take that information from you, and then he would somehow get it to a KGB officer assigned to the mission in New York.
New York, right.
That was his job
Right.
during that
And Ray,
period.
let me stop you there because it stunned me when I read it. But the documentation is just letter perfect. So we've got a non-Soviet citizen
Right,
that immigrates to the United States
Right.
with his family and with no known connection to the Communist Party, no known connection to any formal intelligence training. He very quickly assumes the role of a trusted agent in the United States immediately upon mutual diplomatic recognition between the United States and the Soviet Union.
yes,
It's a stunning story.
right, yeah,
And if you don't mind, there's the fabulous story that you describe it. We kind of have to left to infer the importance of it, but with the Waldorf Astoria, Roosevelt has become president.
Right.
He makes trips to New York.
Right.
And you describe this wonderful, just this fabulous short O. Henry Ice piece about Roosevelt making visits to New York.
right,
And Weisband having access to the secret way up into the Waldorf Astoria for a wheelchaired president of the United States, right?
yes, that's right.
Fabulous.
Yeah, yeah. He came in. You can actually go there if you have a contact and see it. Roosevelt would come in from Washington D.C. The train would go into Manhattan, and at Grand Central, where it would normally stop, everybody was clued in. Secret Service clued everybody in. Someone would hit a switch, and it would go on a siding, and it's all underground now. Remember this, and it would go on a siding, and then it would go directly underneath the Waldorf Astoria. Many wealthy people would have their own. This was not a day of planes that would go into LaGuardia. LaGuardia really didn't exist. Kennedy didn't exist, but the big shots all came in underneath, and then a door would open. He would be in his limousine. The limousine would come right off of the side of the train onto a platform, onto a freight elevator that could carry the weight, and then whoop, right up onto the main floor of the Waldorf Astoria. He'd get off. He'd be in his wheelchair into his elevator and right up to the presidential suite at the Waldorf Astoria, which still exists today. So my point is, and I don't have any direct evidence of this, of course, but my point is he was strategically placed to be able to inform the Russians when he was coming in, where he would be, maybe something about his itinerary, could give his timetables, his comings and goings. And that is, you think, well, that's interesting. That's more than interesting, okay? That's information about the chief executive of the United States, which would be essential. It would be an essential element of information for any foreign intelligence service to be able to give that information. Yeah.
So in this first period, what appears to me to be, from my reading of the book, three very distinct, if not more, but at least a minimum of three distinct operational periods in his relationship with the Soviets. So we have this early period in Manhattan, confined almost exclusively to New York.
Right.
And he's acting not only as a courier, but he's now starting to get involved in spotting and in handling, right? So he moves. So now we see the introduction of Congressman Dickstein, right? And we've got the committees down here in the Hill, but he is up in New York, and now he's being brought in to actually handle people. Right?
Yes.
So let's close out his period of handling and or couriering here in New York, and then we'll move on to what then becomes really an eye-opener for me when he goes out to L.A. And
when
he goes out to L.A.
Oh, yeah.
In the second operational period.
Right.
So
yeah.
Anything more about his New York time before he gets sent out to Los Angeles?
Well, he's the thing I emphasize when it comes to Weisband, to an audience of informed people like yourself, this was not somebody who was doing this for ideological reasons. There is this mindset that all of these, or most of these spies that were working for the Soviet Union were recruited through the means of the Communist Party. When we think about this, we think about Bentley, Elizabeth Bentley. We think about the Ware Group in Washington, D.C. We think about
Silvermaster, Perlow,
Silvermaster, Perlman, and Chambers, and all. Nada. This is not the case at all with him. He is a man who has absolutely no moral compass at all. He is a gambler, a serial gambler. He is a serial womanizer. He is absolutely self-absorbed. And he is, most important, he's absolutely greedy. He is doing this for money. This is like his own part-time job. And so what happens is, this is what he's doing. He is serving as a courier. He's actually recruited a very important spy that worked right here on Capitol Hill. She was a clerk and had a very modest position, but she knew everything. And this was an era when I was talking to the historians up on Capitol Hill. They made it a point to tell me that, unlike today, if you're on the you're a senator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Democrats have their own staff, the Democratic staff. The Republicans have their own staff. At that time, there was one staff that handled everything.
And they were shared.
And they had tremendous access to material, classified, what we would call today classified material. So he was handling agents. He was serving as a courier. He was smuggling in sources into the United States. I have a very interesting chapter on the smuggling of the sources into the United States. And then what happens is he gets orders to handle another source out in California. His name is Jones Orrin York.
And before, if I might interrupt.
Go right ahead.
But before he goes to L.A., he takes advantage of not a one-time, but a seldom-timed initiative on the part of the Soviets, on the part of the NKVD, right? They are now looking for radio operaters.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
And so before he leaves New York, you come across this fabulous trove of records with from his radio training, which then rolls into what mounts to the rest of his life and his important stuff.
I mean, that goes to the point I made earlier about serendipity. This was a very smart man. He had a very, very high intelligence. I'm not criticizing him for that. He had a very, very high intelligence. And it was just, I always tell people, God loves little children and drunks, okay? And I kind of fall right in between that, okay? What happened is, it's 1936, and that's where the Bureau's file came in so beautifully. It really did. Because when you begin to... when you begin to look at it, you begin to see he's a charter member of the, he led a very bohemian lifestyle, okay? But he's a charter member of the Waldorf. But what you see is over the next roughly 6 years, his salary's going down, down, down. And his status is going down. He had a white-collar job in the back room as a tabulator. He knew how to handle the tabulation machines, which was later very important for him when he gets to the Army Security Agency. And then you see his status going down, down, down. He's not making much money. And then what does he do? He quits his job in May of 1936. And you're saying, why the heck is he quitting his job? Well, what happens is, thanks to our good friend Dave Thomas, Dave had access to what were called the mask documents. And there were about 14,000 of them, I think. And Dave gave me all of them. And the mask documents were decrypts of messages sent from Moscow to radio operators around the world, all over the place, from China to New York, okay? And then what you begin to see in 1933, and what's the Comintern? The Comintern is the Communist International. They had their own separate intelligence service, which very few people know. So they're sending out, beginning around March or April, they're sending out requests for radio operators. We want you to find young men who are vetted, who are part of our program, to determine if they would become radio operators, because people are not doing the job, they're unhappy with it. And what do you see as you read the mask information? You see, what does it do? It corresponds to his quitting his job.
Right, right.
And then you begin to look at, okay, where is he going? He's going to the Radio Institute of America. That's the original Guglielmo Marconi radio school in Lower Manhattan. So then you have to ask yourself, he has no job, he has no income. What's the tuition at the RCA Institute in New York? Again, I'm lucky because in Bowie, I live in Bowie, Maryland, and Bowie has the Radio Museum.
Right. It's an amazing
and it's a
story of
beautiful
coincidence.
little building. It's just a nondescript building. So I called them, and he said, oh, yes, we have all the information about the radio school. And it shows what the courses are, what the tuition is. I won't go into further detail, but when you take the tuition, let's say you want to take a tuition in shortwave radio techniques, okay? The course on shortwave radio techniques. Well, you look at the tuition. The tuition is $500 for the course, and you think, well, that's not much. But remember, he's not working, and this is the Depression.
Right.
So $500, really, if you amortize it into 2020, it's $4,000.
Right.
People live for a year on $400, and he's taking all of these courses. But this later plays a huge role
Right.
in his treachery, his real treachery. It was really quite an eye-opener, and it was a fun chapter to write.
And just the records piece was just phenomenal.
Oh, yeah, I mean, the
Yeah.
records where he didn't use it at that point, you know, and we kind of lose traction of what he did with it at all, whether he actually used it, but this is the fault of this is the weakness of the Vasiliev notebooks.
Yeah.
Because Vasiliev got so far, and he said, well, I'm going to do some more on him.
Right.
So it's like a smorgasbord of information.
Right.
Yeah.
So he comes to the end of his period of operation in New York because he gets
orders to California. And he gets orders to handle a very important industrial source in California. His name is Jones Orrin York. And I won't begin to tell you about Jones Orrin York. I won't tell you much because he is strange. He's a very strange human being. And one little story I'll tell you, he worked for a number of different
aerospace companies.
Aerospace engineers.
Right.
And but the most important and critical period when he was being handled by the KGB out there, he was working on the P-38 Lightning. Now, the P-38 Lightning was the holy grail. It was, if you go to the Air and Space Museum out in the Usvar Hazy Center, they have one out there. And he was responsible for the gun carriage. In the past, if you see World War II video, you see the planes are flying along, and where are the weapons mounted? They're mounted on the wing.
In the wings, right.
Okay? This was very much like, if you're familiar with the A-10 Warthog, the Iraqis were terrified of it. All the weapon array is in the nose of the plane, number one, and the plane is not like this. Doesn't take off like this. The plane has what they call a triangle carriage underneath. It was a state-of-the-art plane. He was working on it. It was top secret, and he was working on that. And that's what he provided to Weisband. The interesting thing was, this is what I had a lot of fun. I don't know about my long-suffering wife, but whenever things caught up to him, he would disappear. He would go up into Oregon and sleep in a tent. He would go up to...
And we're talking about York here, not Weisband.
Yeah,
we're
not
talking about
Weisband, York. He would disappear. Well, things got tough because he thought that the FBI was closing in on him. So where does he go? He goes cross-country. I won't begin to describe it. but he goes up to Champlain, New York, thinking he can walk into
Canada.
And this is the dead of winter, okay? We're not talking about a brain surgeon here, okay? So he says, the Canadian said, how much money do you have? He says, I have no money. So he said, well, so you can't come in. So what does he do in the wintertime? Now, snow is up to about here. He walks to where? He walks to New Hampshire, where it's even worse, okay? Right. So he ends up in a place called Coos County, Maine. Now, I bumped into a guy a year or so ago who winters in Aruba. And he said, Ray, we don't even go to Coos County, Maine, and we're from New Hampshire. So he spent the whole year there living in a hut.
Right.
Okay. And then
kind of a self-created.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So he comes back, and Weisband handles him because the guy's able to get a job, and Weisband handles him for a year. Almost a full year, because it was May of 1921. He's in L.A.
Back in L.A.
And then what happens is he had a girlfriend. Her name was, I think, Patricia Baines. And she understood him. She said, we're never going to get married. We'll be lovers. We'll just have a very good time. She came out to California to join him. And I write about this, their last night. He was getting drafted into the Army in September of 42. And he spends his last night with her. You can imagine they're having a quiet dinner, a couple of drinks in a hotel or a restaurant. And they're musing to each other about where's this war going to go? What's going to happen to us?
Right.
Okay, and you're thinking, am I even going to survive the war? And she later told the FBI that the only thing he thought about was when the war was over, he just wanted the money to keep on coming in from the KGB.
Right.
And that was the only thing that was in his mind. And when you look at the Vasiliev notebooks, you look at the period from 42 to 45, and there's a big blank there because they were never in touch with him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And we'll cover that in a second, because that even has a twist at the end of that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And we'll leave York aside, because as you said, that's probably another book for somebody, right?
Yeah.
But he does.
That was the other thing I had, by the way. I had the original York file.
Which was, because you and I were texting different file numbers. The Bureau has a very, very distinct, prescribed method of file keeping.
Yes.
And there were some showing up under treason file numbers versus espionage. And those have different. Tim, I'm not sure you would have recognized them, but the research here was fabulous. But per your request, we'll leave York behind for a moment, except to say, so now comes into play 3 or 4 people we've been watching bounce around. I've been watching bounce around for 40 years. So we have Gregory Kiefitz is coming down from San Francisco.
Right. Yeah.
We see Stanislav Shumovsky, who acquires a whole new...
Who recruited him.
Yeah, and he acquires a whole new importance in terms of aerospace and very, 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 very effective recruiter out of his own...
You had Mikhail Gorin, who was later he was probably the first Russian ever to be in PNG'd out of the country.
Right, he's Amtorg tourist, right?
Yeah, and he was the tourist.
Right.
And then you had illegals. Right. You had Emmanuel Bloch.
So we have this enormous Soviet intelligence operation going on the West Coast.
Very sophisticated.
Which was kind of opaque to me until I read your book. So it's fascinating. And we'll come back to it because, of course, the York connection then winds up starting an unraveling when it comes to your guy Weisband.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But he leaves L.A. because he gets drafted
into the Army.
Right.
Yeah. And again, by serendipity, he just drops down a rabbit hole and he falls into the mother lode because he's drafted in Los Angeles, and then he takes what millions of every draftees took. He took the Army aptitude test, and it's quite clear he scored at the top. So he has a brief assignment at Camp Gardner in Northern California, and where do they send him? Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. Now, for those of you not familiar with Fort Monmouth was the West Point of the Signal Intelligence Corps. So he goes to Fort Monmouth in January of 1942. He was OCS, so he was there for 90 days. And that demonstrates also how intelligent he was because he didn't wash out. The washout rate at the Signal Corps school was very, very high. But he's introduced here to all of the top secret training methodologies that were produced by William Friedman. And he's from the very basic training right up to the most advanced. And then he graduates in April of 1943. He then comes out to Vint Hill Farms. Many of you are probably familiar with Vint Hill Farms.
Which is, and that's a fabulous story.
That's a fabulous
Another piece of serendipity.
Yeah.
Right? The owner in Vint Hill is just sitting, and he's all of a sudden...
He's a farmer.
He's a farmer.
He actually he's a shortwave radio operator.
And he picks up spurious signals one night.
Yep.
And he does the right thing as an American citizen. So finish that story.
Yeah, so what happens is he's a farmer. And God bless him, he's a farmer. But at night, what he does is he's a shortwave radio operator. So he's picking up radio broadcasts from Berlin. So he does the right thing. He calls the Army, and the Army comes in, sends someone out. He has a lovely lunch for the guy, and he goes in the back room. 2 weeks later, he's being given a check for about $150,000, which is a lot of money at that time. And he said, "You're out of here. We're taking it over. We're buying your farm." So he didn't have any. He had no choice but to sell his farm. As it turns out, Vint Hill Farm sits on some type of a strange geological formation that makes it ideal for them to pick up these signals. So that's what they turned it out. What happens then is that whole operation moves to Eritrea. And Eritrea, for the few who don't know, is in North Africa, where they had even better opportunities to collect because of the geological formation. And they turn Vint Hill Farms into the signal, radio signal, I've lost it, analyst, radio signal
RTA, the radio traffic analyst.
Traffic analyst.
RTA.
Exactly. Right. So what does he do? He gets assigned there.
Right.
And then they supposedly did a background check on him. Well, they never did any background check on him. They did. If it was somebody should be strung up by their toes, because they would have been able to pick up. If they did the background, he had been arrested in New York for
getting in a fight with the landlord.
Yeah, he had been arrested in New York for skipping out on the rent, on his rent, and that involved him smuggling. That's another whole story. Him smuggling people in. You can't make a movie out of this. It's so unbelievable. But he smuggles somebody in. He gets arrested. And they would have picked that up, so nobody picked that up. And as they point out, they weren't doing any background investigation. If you had the qualifications, that was good enough. So he goes to Vint Hill Farms, becomes a radio signal analyst, and then he goes to Western Europe.
Right.
Or he goes to England from there.
And that could be its own book, Ray. We're going to leave that behind because we want to leave time for questions, and we have to get to what really becomes the meat of the Bill Weisband story. So he spends his time during the war, comes out of the war, wants to go right back into making money. As you said, he's transactional, he's not ideological.
Exactly.
And so we find him then winding up literally down the street, down here in Arlington Hall.
Arlington Hall.
So pick up the story there.
Yeah.
He's in Arlington Hall, and then his world starts to kind of tighten around him.
Yeah, what happens
by a series of things that happens.
Yeah, what happens is the Russians are desperately trying to find him. If you're familiar with the history of the KGB, you'll know the name Lona Cohen. Lona Cohen was a very, very important courier.
Helen Kroger, to our friends over on the other side of the pond, if they're listening, because she becomes an illegal during the Portland spy ring 20 years later.
She's given instructions to try and find him. So what you find is, that she's calling either the brother or the mother, saying, "Oh, I'm an old friend of Bill's. How's he doing? Where is he?" And so they're trying to keep tabs on him. And I'll simply say that, well, he was in North Africa. He was in Italy, and the Soviets sent a military delegation, a naval delegation, to Italy to observe how naval operations. And who do you think is asked to be the interpreter for the Russian delegation, Weisband.
Right.
So Weisband does the delegation, and what does he do? He saddles up to a naval commander, and he basically tells them, hey, I'm one of you. I'm trying to get in touch with the KGB. Tell them I'm all right. Tell them in February of 1945, I'm going to be back in the United States. I'm going to have a good job. So what happens is, and I'll skip over this very briefly, Alexander Feklisov, who is
iconic in our line of work.
Iconic
Right.
in our
This is one of the iconic figures in our line of work.
we're probably sitting no more than 2 or 3 miles from the Occidental restaurant, where in 1961, he had a quiet conversation with John Scali, the ABC news correspondent, and he met him. His cover name was Fomin. His real name was Feklisov, Fomin. His cover name was Fomin. By now, Feklisov is the KGB resident in Washington, and he is quietly telling Scali, look, get in touch with President Kennedy. Get in touch with the White House. What we want to do is diffuse the what am I struggling to say? The Cuban Missile Crisis. So this guy was sharp. In 1945, when he met him, he was still a low man on a totem pole.
Right.
But they had him out in front of the Astor Theater every Friday night, every third Friday of every month, out in front of the Astor Theater, waiting for him to show up. What happens here is the war is now winding down in Europe. The Allies expect it to be over, would you believe, in December 1945. They didn't count on the Bulge, the Battle of the Bulge, extending things. So he is now expendable. So his boss, Colonel Harold Hayes, who later becomes the director of the Army Security Agency, he says, I want you to come back with me to Army Security Agency at Arlington Hall, and we want you to be a Russian interpreter in a new project. So he says, yes, sir. So he goes back to Arlington Hall. He arrives there probably in November of 44, January of 45, and he's placed right at the center of the top secret, even by Arlington Hall standards, where everything was top secret. They place him right at the center of the even deeper top secret that most of the people in Army security had no idea existed. And what we were doing here was trying to break Russian codes, the codes of our allies. And I try to explain, I try to emphasize to the reader just how significant this was. And he was right there. There was never any background done. There was never any effort to look into it. There was no vetting, and he's right there. He is literally, as Dean Acheson writes in his memoirs about 1945, he is literally present at the creation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
As I say, you can't make this up. You know?
So we've got not native-born Ukrainian, but of Ukrainian background, right?
Yeah, he's really more.
When the borders are moving,
you would say, Ukrainian
via
background.
Egypt, through New York,
Yeah.
down here out Route 50 at Arlington Hall.
Right.
And he is sitting, to use your term, or Dean Acheson, the president of the creation, as we're starting to break back the Soviet.
We're struggling to break into
Soviet radio.
We don't even know it's a one-time pad. And this is where I get down in the weeds, because we don't even know it's a one-time pad. Remember, this is January roughly in 1945. We don't really start breaking into it until maybe 1947, 1948. Right. So there's a 2-year period where we're blind and we're deaf.
And it's just brute force. They're just trying to break the ciphers with brute force.
And just the brain power of so many, many interesting men and women.
And he's not a crippy, but he is a linguist.
No.
And so he's got kind of side saddle relationship to what's going on at Arlington Hall.
That's right. Because once they begin to break it out, it's his job to pick up colloquialisms.
Right, 'cause they're
to
breaking
pick
out
up
into the native
idiosyncrasies
language.
in the language.
Right.
They were trying desperately, beginning in 1944, to train men, and they were all men, interestingly enough, or they were trying to train men to speak and comprehend Russian. It's not like trying to learn Spanish. It's not like trying to learn French. It's an entirely different language with an entirely different alphabet. I sat down with Dmitry Druzhinsky, who was a Russian. He did a lot of undercover work. And I said, Dmitry, explain this to me, okay? There are terminologies, there are idiosyncrasies, there are colloquialisms that are in the actual messages that someone who is classically trained in the Russian language would be clueless when they read it. You have to be able to have picked it up in your household to be able to understand it. And we had virtually none. So he was like a diamond when it came to
So by virtue of his placement there, then he makes his Russian handlers aware of what we're trying to do.
Correct.
To their radio intercept.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was not only able to tell them, able to tell them, hey, they're going after your stuff, but he was actually able to tell them where we are in our progress.
So we have two opportunities here to come to one of two different stops.
Right.
Okay, because I'm mindful of our time, Amanda, and we want to have some questions asked. So by virtue, apparently, of Weisband providing information to his handler, we come upon something that for us in the CI world and the crypto world becomes known within the community as Black Friday. Right?
Black Friday, yeah.
So if you could describe that, because then there starts an unraveling, an introspection as to what's gone wrong, where might we have a problem, and of course, eventually that doesn't lead to his arrest, but other things conspire to bring his activity as a spy to an end, which winds up with his death in 1967, right down the street here.
Yeah, that whole issue is in many respects very opaque. And it's opaque because NSA really doesn't, even today doesn't know, because there's not a lot written about it. But I feel very comfortable that I've mined everything that's there.
Right.
Now, what happens here is, and just to be brief, by 1947, we meaning the American cryptographers, are beginning to make significant inroads into Russian communications. We're making fantastic inroads when it comes to plain text, okay? And plain text they're messages that the Russians are sending out, but they're not encoding them. So what we're able to do is able to take this plain text information and bits of plain text, and we're actually able to form a picture of the Russian military establishment. Right. Very, very clear from the plain text. If you ask a question, I'll be happy to answer it, how we got into it. It's fascinating how we got into that.
Right.
People think that, well, okay, he gave up Venona, or that Philby actually gave up Venona. He was involved in Venona he was probably a part of the Venona team back in 1946 as a Russian linguist, okay? And Meredith Gardner is the genius behind Venona. He sat as far away from Gardner as I'm sitting from you. That's how he was looking over his shoulder. And I could imagine, I'd sit there and think about him, and he knew exactly what was happening. Names are starting to come out. Okay, we know about the names of the people behind the atomic bomb.
Right.
And all of a sudden, other names, spies are coming out.
Though ironically, his name only appears, as far as I can tell, 3 times in all the Venona traffic.
Yeah, right, and it's not his name.
It's not his name,
No, it's his code name.
Right.
But he's sitting there, and he's got to be sweating, because he's thinking, is my name going to be the next one that's popping out, okay? So he made a quick point of telling the KGB that they had this. And then the mother lode, and this gets very, very, virtually no press at all, the progress that these geniuses at ASA, Army Security Agency, they're the predecessor of NSA, what they're doing is they are beginning to crack in to Soviet encrypted code.
Right. From plain text now to
We're
encrypted,
going
which are
plain text
the
now to
family
encrypted
jewels.
stuff. They're top secret stuff. They're the stuff that they're encrypted with one-time pads and other sophisticated machine-generated coding systems. And now, as my dear friend Lou Benson said, God bless him, he said at one point we were able to read Air Force comms, Army comms, military comms, Gulag comms, industrial comms, and most specifically, leadership comms.
Right.
Now, were we reading them every time, real time? No. But we were able to get a wonderful picture of what they were saying to each other, their order of battle, where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, what their intentions are. And we also have to keep in mind, because I get great debates with all of my colleagues who have worked espionage in the past. They talk about people like Rick Ames. They talk about people like Robert Hansen. Talk about people like John Walker. Well, he wasn't as good as John Walker. I beg to differ, my friend. He was worse than John Walker. Because when we had John Walker and we had Ames and we had Hansen, when they're conducting spying and then we're doing an after-action report, you have to realize that we did, even though we had tremendous losses, we had other assets that we could use. We had satellites, we had OSINT, okay, we had FISINT, we have MASINT, all these numerous numbers of different ints that we have. We have satellites that can see, that can sniff, that can hear. We had all of this stuff to compensate. When he's giving it up, there is zero.
Right. In the late 40s, it's the only game in town.
It's
and
going.
He's giving it up.
That's all that you had
Right.
was Comint. The Brits call it SIGINT. We call it Comint. There was nothing else. So when we lost that, we lost the ability to track Russian intentions when it came. Remember, this is in 1948. Okay, what's going on? This is when he gives up the mother lode. What's going on in 48? The KGB is consolidating under Russian control all of Central Europe. 1948 is the Berlin airlift. We have no idea what is happening when it comes to what Russian intentions with regard to the Berlin airlift. 1948, what else do we have? We have and people don't really put a lot of emphasis on this, we have the Marshall Plan. How is the Soviet Union going to reply to the Marshall Plan? And the other thing in 48, we don't realize this, but we were terrified that the Russians, they still had about 3 or 4 million troops in Central Europe. Are they going to attack Western Union? And what else happens? That is the greatest loss of all. We lost everything it's called Black Friday, and it occurs in November of 1948. Black Friday is what they call it, but it didn't occur on a Friday. Interestingly enough, it occurred over 3 or 4 days, from about a Sunday to about a Tuesday or a Wednesday. And all of those crypto systems, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, etc., you could see people in front of their screens in late November 1948, all of them disappear. Boop, boop, boop.
So over a short week, they just turn off the lights.
They just turn off
and we
everything.
go dark.
We just go
We go
dark.
blind and deaf.
And to this day, unless something's gone on, we've never recovered them. And the head of NSA, the head of ASA, Harold Hayes, and I go into a lot about Harold Hayes, because Harold Hayes, God rest his soul, was a colonel, later became a general. He was Weisband's drinking buddy. And when I read the Bureau file, they later, after Weisband was identified, and that's another very interesting story, how when he was identified, the FBI went in and started interviewing people, and they said, oh, yeah, we knew he was a heavy drinker.
Right.
Oh, yeah, we knew he was a gambler. He was a heavy gambler. Right. Yeah, we knew he was losing money. In fact, I went to the gambling parlor with him a couple of times, and he was losing tons. But by 1948, nobody knew that. But the curious part was he was in and out of Hayes' office all the time. So the director of naval cryptography and Harold Hayes, who's the head of Army cryptography, they get together trying to figure out what happened. How did we lose this? And curiously enough, the head of the naval cryptography says, well, they probably just were able to upgrade their systems. And here is Hayes with Weisband walking in and out of the office, and he's speculating. He says, no, I think we have somebody on the inside. Little did he know, the guy was walking in and out of his office.
His office, right.
It was an amazing story. It really was.
And in our line of work, this, you should know, becomes a constant theme over 60 years. When we lose, or the other side loses capability, you're always inclined to think somebody upgraded something or something else went wrong. We're always disinclined to look for a spy in our own midst. We are preternaturally disinclined to think we've been betrayed by one of our own.
Right. Counterintelligence people are suspicious bastards. Okay? That's not a technical term, okay? But we are. We're always suspicious, okay? But people outside, and I'm not criticizing them, people like Hayes did have an instinct, but others basically say, no, they're just upgrading their systems.
Right.
But usually there is somebody on the inside. Exactly.
So we see the most dramatic effect of his compromise with Black Friday, which becomes the Black Friday week. So
in the eve, literally on the eve of the Korean War.
Right.
Where we lose all access.
Almost
and we had no Chinese speakers.
Right. Almost as importantly, 8 months
speakers.
later, they detonate the bomb, and we have no idea it's coming. In August of 49,
exactly.
They detonate the bomb, and we're years away from thinking they were close.
That's right. That's exactly
So let's do this. Amanda, if I can just ask for some guidance from you in terms of time.
I'm delighted to provide some guidance.
Yes. Can we keep going, or do you want us to? Because we are at the end of his damage. We have not covered the fact of his arrest yet, how we identified him in his arrest.
Speed through that, and anyone, if you need to be somewhere, dinner, heavy drinking, gambling, you can go on.
Or wait for us.
Yeah. Well, just tell us where to meet you. But go and then we'll.
What was interesting about his identification was what goes around comes around. We'll go back to Jones, Orr, and York.
Right.
York is told, let me rephrase that, Weisband in August of 1942, remember he gets drafted in September of 42. York tells him, Weisband tells him, look, I'm going on to a new assignment. Never told him that he was going in the Army. I'm going on to a new assignment. You're going to be met by another handler. So he is then taken over after Weisband leaves by a courier. He's a pure courier. His name is Nelson Sabatini. Sabatini is an Italian person who grew up in a very poor situation in Pennsylvania, born and raised in Pennsylvania. He worked in the coal mines in Pennsylvania, and then he joined the Communist Party. He was recruited as a courier and then became a full-time courier. Okay, now, let's roll the camera forward from 1942 when Nelson Sabatini takes him over to roughly 1949 or thereabouts. Remember I talked about Venona and the Venona Project. And Venona is the project that Meredith Gardner of ASA and Robert Lamphere were both working on. So they're cracking into these one-time pad diplomatic codes. And whose name do they stumble upon but Nelson Sabatini? They'd interviewed Sabatini before, and he basically bogarted his way through it. I'm not telling you guys a thing. Well, what happens now is they interview him in late 49.
And being Sabatini,
forgive me, Sabatini in late 49, and he cracks, not completely, but he cracks partially. And he said, yeah, I was a courier, and I did handle a guy by the name of Jones or in York. So naturally, in April, not naturally, but in April of 1949, they go to York and they sit him down. And they had what I used to call with my children a come to Jesus meeting, okay? And they're sitting with him, and he folds like wet cardboard, all right? He just starts, bleh. And so he said, I was handled by a guy named Brooks, who we identified later as Emmanuel Block. I'm handling a guy named Werner, who we identified as another courier by the name of Zelmont Franklin. Then I was handled by a guy, this is York talking, and York is saying, he says, I can't remember his name. His name was Bill. And then he said, it's something like waistband or waist. So they show him a picture because he was under our radar for something else, less concerning. They show him, he says, that's the guy, Bill Weisband.
So and that leads to Weisband's demise, right?
That's right.
And it should be pointed out for everybody, even though we had gotten to York and we got into Sabatini through Venona by code names, right? Needle, and we couldn't do any of these interviews and allude to the fact we had cracked the codes in much the same way as Fuchs, right? We had gotten Fuchs out of Venona and sent it to MI5 and New Scotland Yard, but you could never allude to the fact we had cracked the code because you didn't want to give up the method. Yeah. Right. So they had to come by it, interview and interrogation. So credit to two agents. Yeah. I don't know.
And not only
out
that,
in LA division.
That was the policy. That was a policy as long as Venona was existed.
Until 1980.
Even after for 40 or so years, and even after that, we would go to somebody, we'd sit down and we'd talk to them, but we never told them about it. Was we actually, a secret, you know. So that's what happened, and then he was interviewed, and we can maybe briefly talk about that. He had a lengthy interview, which he was able to. He was such a terror. He was so bad and so egregious, but he had such an arrogant attitude. Like, how dare you even interview me? This was his attitude. But that's what really caused him to lose his job. He was fired from ASA. His wife was fired from ASA. Mabel. Right. And then we go right through the summer, and it's a long, complicated story.
But he gets arrested not because he was a spy, but he gets arrested because he refuses a subpoena.
Yeah, he was. They got it on a very, very flimsy because the problem that they had. That's what's wonderful is you can look at the U.S. Attorney and the Department of Justice, and there was absolutely zero evidence that could be produced in court.
Right.
And the only evidence that could be produced in court was Jones or in York. Now, he was not the best witness in the world because we've already got him admitting to espionage.
Right.
And we only have his word. And as Lamar Hardy, no, I forgot his name, forget that, the U.S. Attorney in Los Angeles, he said, if we put this guy on a stand, a good defense attorney is going to just tear him apart. Right. So the only time he ever spent was about 1 year for failure to appear at a grand jury. And he spent that at McNeil Island in Washington.
So one of the great spies of all time against U.S. interests spent a year because he will not deign to show up before the grand jury and testify.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
So he spends a year in jail, gets out, moves back here into the area. So he becomes a local here. In fact, his son is still a musician in the area. Bill is still...
Exactly. One of the most interesting things I found was, and it's a reason why they call it the spy erased from, I call it the spy erased from history. And this was fascinating. And one of my heroes in this is Court Jones. I mean, he was so smart. He was the FBI agent who was the case agent.
His dad. Yeah.
And he just passed away a couple of years ago, and his son and I worked together, Court Jones Jr. And the most interesting, he said he knew this guy. He knew this guy. He could have been like Dave Charney over here. Thank you for being here, Dave. But he understood the psychology of this guy. And the terrifying scenario for the Army was he was a veteran. And under the new rules and regulations, if he gets fired, he could apply for his job back. and he can go through the equivalent of a loyalty board investigation. And if he goes through the equivalent of a loyalty board investigation, he has a right to a public trial.
And
if he has a right to a public trial, he can call witnesses.
Right.
Washington Post can be there. The New York Times can be there. And it's essential for viewers and the audience to understand that it's not like today. We're at the International Spy Museum. You have beautiful displays touching on every aspect of intelligence. The Congress didn't know that we were conducting these comment operations.
Right.
The budget for it was completely off the books.
Right.
Nobody knew. And we had nothing else. We had a 2-year-old, 3-year-old CIA, but they're still trying to put their organization together. So we had nothing. And their greatest fear, the nightmare scenario for the joint, for our leadership, Joint Chiefs of Staff, was that he would get his job. But Jones knew in his gut that he'd never go through with it. He kept trying to go through, went through all the process, and then he asked the $64 question. He says, where is my testimony? If I get up and I testify, where is my transcript going to go? Is the FBI going to get it? And they say, yes, they'll get a copy of this. And then the day before he was scheduled to go to trial, he walks into the head of the loyalty board and says, I don't want to do it. I'm not going to do it.
And so he disappears into history.
And he just disappears right into history. Everything was swept under the rug. It was swept under the rug for the reasons that I just offered you. It was also swept under the rug because there were a lot of sacred cows at NSA.
Everybody had a conspired interest to make this go.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Not the least of which was Weisband, of course. But
absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
You had Friedman, you had Rowlett, Sinkoff, Kullback, and these are the sacred cows. You know, if you go to NSA today and attend a conference, you go to the William Friedman Auditorium.
Right.
Okay, these are the sacred cows. So there were personal reasons why this wanted to go away, and there were legitimate security reasons why. And that's why the file is so scant when you try to find it, because I don't get the feeling, looking at what they were able to dig up, that there was a concerted effort to try to figure out what happened.
Right.
So it's a remarkable story.
Well, Ray,
really.
better in the telling than in the reading, and the reading was fantastic.
Thank you very much.
So
you're very kind.
let me thank you. It was tremendous. And Amanda, let me give you back your room if you want to throw it out for questions.
Yes, we have just a few minutes left on our Zoom, because the gentleman that's running it has to go to a bachelor party. He's going to kill me. He went home to Indiana for his brother's wedding, and he's running this for us. But we do have time for if anyone has a quick in-person question. I do have one online question. Somebody wanted to know, what was the name of that spy on Capitol Hill?
Lee?
Well, that's interesting. Her name, and her code name was Zero. And her name was Lydia Lee. And she was a clerk. And she had applied, she grew up in New York, she grew up in the Bronx. Her father was a rag salesman. If you've ever read Kirk Douglas's memoir, The Rag Man's Son, that's what her father did. And she went to Columbia University. We don't know how far she got. She married a guy named Millstone, and I tried to track down her late husband. I found out he died, which is understandable, a long time ago. Tried to track down his son, and I wasn't their son. And I think what she did was she came to Washington and reinvented herself. Her name was Lydia Levin, or Lydia Levinsky. And I think because of anti-Semitism that was rife here in Washington, D.C., she simply changed her name to Lydia Lee. And she lived right up by Howard University. I walked it. It wasn't very far. It's about a mile and a half. But That's what if I mentioned to you about the fact there was only one staff.
Yeah.
And she was on what was called the Senate Munitions Committee. And the Senate Munitions Committee was created in 1934 to investigate allegations of collusion. It's hard to get our minds around this today. Investigate allegations of collusion between the American military and the large banks, the big banks, the Morgan banks in New York, the Harrimans, and all of these wealthy plutocrats in collusion with the aircraft and munitions industry to foment the First World War. In other words, they created the First World War. They forced our involvement. Why? So that they could make so much money.
Right.
And this was a rationalization that came out of the horrors of the First World War, the millions and millions of soldiers, French, German. We were French, German, English. We were very fortunate, far less. But that's what it came out of. So they had subpoena power to go into Army, Air Force, Navy, classified documents, and she handled all of these things. And again, as John mentioned earlier, we were talking about the information that led to him going into radio school.
Right.
That was called the MASK, M-A-S-K information. And you see in the MASK information orders coming from Moscow to find out as much as you can about what it was going on. But yeah, she remained in the on Congress as a staffer. I have a photograph of her taken, I think, around 1942 or 1943, with 3 or 4 other ladies, and they're protesting the fact that the buses in Washington D.C. are not air conditioned. So you get it's a really good photograph. Yeah.
Maybe this will be our last question. Thank you, sir.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank
sir.
you for that talk. I was really struck by the point that you mentioned that he was able to get into such a sensitive position without any sort of serious vetting.
Yes, sir.
And I was wondering if you could go into your understanding of the reasons for that. Was there like less of a sense in the popular imagination of just the idea that a double agent could exist, or was it more a lack of operational capabilities
Right.
to do a good background check, or like a lack of prioritization of that from not having learned tough lessons in the past? Just like, how did that come about?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's an important question to understand. In other words, how did he slip in is really the question. It was because, for all intents and purposes, there was no security regime in place. You even see this today. If we're desperate for a linguist, if we're desperate for somebody who's got rare capabilities in computer intelligence or AI, we're going to just give him an interim clearance, okay? And then we'll do the background investigation. This is what happened, interestingly. I'm not going off in a tangent, but Chelsea Manning, Bradley Manning, this is what happened. He was given access because they needed people, and what they did was, and this happens all the time, they disregard the counterintelligence and security aspect of it. But in their case, at that time, there was very, very little regard for clearances, very little regard. If you had the capability, you were in. Let's take, for example, it's a low-level example, but it kind of makes the point. Mabel Weisband. Mabel was an innocent young girl, had graduated from high school, and 2 years later she's at ASA. They did no background on it, not one. Now she's involved in this. She's right at Army. She's right at Arlington Hall. She's involved in the decryption of the Japanese naval codes, because the Army had its own Navy. Magic, for example. And essentially, I'm putting 2 and 2 together. She knew Frank Rowlett when she was from Asheville, North Carolina. She never had any access to anything. And someone like Rowlett said, yeah, I knew her father, great guy, blah, blah, blah. and that's how she got in. Then they had this other wacky system, okay, that if you were like, let's take Asheville. If you were from Asheville and you had sort of an Anglo-Saxon name, you had a higher chance of getting in, or actually pretty much had the same chance of somebody who came from New York and you had a name like Batvinis, okay, or you had a name like Quattrocki.
No, that's not
okay,
too far.
Because your parents were immigrants. They wouldn't take you if you were an immigrant, okay, but they could take you if you were the son of an immigrant or the daughter of an immigrant. But if they had followed that, they wouldn't have been able to bring in William Friedman, who founded the whole thing. So they just disregarded it. When they began to investigate him in earnest, what they found there were 2 forms that he filled out, and he had to hit a checkbox. And the checkbox, the answer is kind of long, lengthy sentence, but basically one says, are you not a spy? Are you not loyal to America? Are you loyal to America? In both instances, one year, one the next, he said, I'm not loyal to America. I know, it's bizarre, isn't it? And they only found that 3 years later, once they identified him as a spy. So the best answer I can get was something like Rowlett said. He said, we were babes. We didn't know what we were doing. We weren't really paying any attention to it. There was no background investigation. There were no polygraphs. There were no interviews. There was no vetting, going back and look at his history. Nothing like that existed. It was a different time. Does that answer your question? Does that help you? Yeah, great. Okay, good. Yeah.
This has truly been fascinating. Ray, thank you for researching and writing this book. Thank you for speaking tonight. And John, thank you for your incredible structuring and your insight. I mean, fantastic.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give one more shout out to Dave Charney, because Dave Charney was instrumental. He was pivotal in going back and detailing in much, much further depth his noir paper. It's online. I urge you to read it if you're interested in the psychology of spying. Go back and read it, because it was absolutely terrific. And he was very, very kind enough to read my chapter, in which I detail quite a bit about the work that he did. Dave interviewed. He was asked by the defense of Earl Pitts, who was an FBI spy, and the defense for Robert Hansen, to sit down with both of those guys and sit down with them for hours over many, many, many months, and just try to get into their minds and get into their psyches as to why they did what they did. I've got to believe that the tapes that you've collected are probably worth $1 million, probably more than that to a collector, Dave. They're just, I haven't seen them, haven't heard them, but just the mere fact that they have them has to be.
I'll give it to you for $98.
I'll give you cash tonight.
All
thank
right.
you.
We have a lot of good friends here and amazing people, and we can adjourn. I cannot speak today. Excuse me, guys. Adjourn to the hallway. Ray will be signing books if you would like to buy one, or if you already have one. So thank you so much. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, John, and thank you, Dr.
Thank you
Charney,
all.
for being
Thank you all.
here.
Exactly right.